They say blood is thicker than water, but in my family, blood was just something they used to keep track of who was worth it and who was a disappointment. I stood in the rain outside the Grand Cathedral, my fingers tracing the cold iron of the locked gates. Inside, the muffled sound of a pipe organ played a melody I had practiced for months, but I wasn't the one at the piano. My brother, Julian, was marrying into one of the wealthiest families in the country, and in his quest for the perfect high society image, he had decided that I, his sister, the unpredictable one, didn't fit the aesthetic. I checked my phone. No missed calls, no texts, just a digital copy of an invitation that had been accidentally sent to an old address. I wasn't on the list. The security guards, dressed in suits that cost more than my first car, looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. To them, I was just a girl in a trench coat, shivering in the drizzle, looking like a ghost haunting a feast. But I wasn't just any ghost. I was the sister who had worked 3 jobs to put Julian through law school. I was the one who sat by his bed when he had the flu, and the one who defended him against the neighborhood bullies. Growing up, it was just the 2 of us against a world that didn't have much room for orphans with nothing to their names. We had made a pact. To the top, together. Or so I thought. But as Julian climbed, he began to see me as a weight rather than an anchor. He started forgetting to invite me to dinners with his new partners. He stopped answering my calls when he was around his fiancée Clara, a woman who looked at me like I was a smudge on a pristine window. To them, I was just a low-level worker, a girl who had disappeared into the military years ago and surely hadn't amounted to anything. "You should move along, miss," the guard said, his voice cold. "This is a private event for the elite." I looked at him, and for a second, I felt a familiar sting of betrayal. My own brother had authorized a list that didn't include his only living relative. He wanted a perfect wedding, free from the reminder of our humble, dusty beginnings. He wanted the world to see him as a self-made prince, not the boy who once shared a single bed with his sister because the heater was broken. But what I didn't know that day was that Julian's perfect world was about to collide with the reality of the woman I had become. He thought he was protecting his reputation by keeping me out. He had no idea that I was the only person in that room who could actually save it. The rejection cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I walked away from the gates, my heart feeling like it had been crushed under the weight of those massive stone pillars. I found myself in a small coffee shop nearby, staring at the blurred reflection of my face in the window. For years, I had kept my life private. When I joined the Navy, I didn't do it for the glory. I did it to find the discipline and the family I felt I was losing at home. I had risen through the ranks in silence, serving in shadows and on deck, eventually earning a title I rarely used in the real world. I looked at the garment bag resting on the chair next to me. Inside was my dress uniform, the white fabric crisp, the gold braid gleaming, and the medals. The medals that told stories of sacrifices Julian would never understand. I was supposed to be his maid of honor. I was supposed to stand by his side. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. It wasn't a text from Julian. It was an emergency alert from the Naval Command Center. I realized that the ceremony of the year wasn't just a wedding. It was a gathering of some of the most powerful political figures in the state, including the Secretary of Defense, who was a close friend of Clara's father. There was a security threat, a massive logistical failure in the harbor nearby that was threatening the safety of the entire district, including the cathedral. The local police were overwhelmed. The private security Julian hired was useless. They needed a ranking officer on the ground to coordinate the transition between civilian and military response immediately. I didn't hesitate. I went into the restroom of that coffee shop and shed my wet trench coat. I put on the uniform. I pinned the Admiral's stars to my shoulders. I felt the weight of the medals. The Bronze Star, the Distinguished Service Medal. As I adjusted my cap, the girl who had been crying in the rain disappeared. In her place stood Admiral Hayes. I walked back to the cathedral. This time, I didn't go to the guest entrance. I walked straight to the front where the black SUVs and sirens were gathering. The security guard who had told me to move along earlier saw me coming. He went to block my path, but then his eyes traveled from my boots to my stars. He froze. His hand went to his forehead in a shaky, terrified salute. "Admiral, I didn't recognize you, ma'am," he stammered. "I'm sure you didn't," I said, my voice like steel. "Clear the path. I have a situation to handle." I entered the cathedral just as the ceremony was about to reach the vows. The room was filled with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume. Julian stood at the altar, looking like a king, until he saw the commotion at the back of the hall. He looked annoyed at the interruption, ready to signal his guards to remove the intruder, until he saw me. His face went from irritation to confusion, and then to a pale, sickly shade of gray. He recognized the face of the sister he had discarded, but he couldn't reconcile it with the uniform that demanded the respect of every dignitary in that room. The Secretary of Defense stood up, his eyes widening. "Admiral Hayes, what are you doing here?" The room went silent. You could hear a pin drop. Julian's elite friends were staring at me, then at him. The betrayal was out in the open, but now the power had shifted. I didn't make a scene. I didn't need to. I walked up the aisle, the sound of my heels echoing like a heartbeat against the marble. I reached the front, where Julian and Clara stood like statues. Clara looked at my uniform, her mouth slightly open, the realization hitting her that she had spent months insulting a woman who held more power in her pinky finger than Clara's father held in his entire firm. I ignored her. I looked directly at Julian. He tried to speak, but no words came out. He looked like the small, scared boy I used to protect, but I didn't feel that old protective instinct anymore. I felt a cold professional distance. "Secretary, we have a Tier 1 maritime emergency 3 miles from this location," I said, my voice projecting through the silent hall. "I'm here to coordinate the evacuation and the security perimeter. This building is now under military jurisdiction until the threat is neutralized." I turned back to Julian. "I'm sorry to interrupt your perfect day, Julian. I know I wasn't on the list." The guests began to murmur. The Secretary of Defense walked over and shook my hand. "We're lucky you were in town, Admiral. Lead the way." As the guests were ushered out in an orderly fashion, Julian stepped forward, his hand reaching for my arm. "Sarah, I didn't know. I thought you were just... Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at his hand until he pulled it back. "You didn't want to know, Julian? You wanted a sister who made you look good, not a sister who had actually done something with her life. You chose your guest list based on status. It just turns out you didn't have enough status to be on mine." The revenge wasn't in a loud argument or a ruined cake. It was the look on his face as he realized that by trying to hide me, he had missed out on the only person who truly loved him for who he was, not for his title. His new friends weren't looking at him with respect anymore. They were looking at him with judgment, wondering why he had hidden an admiral in his own family. The crisis was resolved by nightfall. The cathedral was empty, the flowers wilting in the dark. Julian reached out to me dozens of times that week, but I didn't answer. Sometimes the only way to heal a broken bond is to let it stay broken until the other person learns the value of what they threw away. I sat in my office at the base, looking at a photo of us when we were kids. I realized then that you can't force people to see your worth. You can only live your life with such integrity and strength that your absence becomes their loudest regret. I found peace not in the rank, but in the truth. I was never the disappointment he thought I was. I was the hero he wasn't brave enough to claim. And as I closed the drawer on that photo, I knew I was finally ready to start a new chapter. One where I was the main character, and the list of people I let into my heart was finally, truly my own.